What the hell is crunch, really? It's likely to be a phrase you've heard before, even if not in the context of video games. In the gaming industry, crunch is described as a crucial period of time in which a studio has to work long hours in order to meet a tight deadline.
I've definitely worked in environments where we've had to do kind of prolonged crunch for months at a time. Some studios do it for a year, it can go massive.
The reasons for and conditions surrounding crunch can vary depending on the scope of the game, the size of the development team, and the nature of the deadline, among other factors. And developers are typically expected to work 12 to 16-hour days, often including weekends throughout this period. It's widely agreed within the industry that crunch is a particularly grueling process for developers, and there's been plenty of debate on the topic as a result. How we might be able to reduce crunch, how it impacts the lives and health of the developers, and whether it's always truly necessary. The thorny issue of crunch reared its head again recently in the wake of the Cyberpunk 2077 delay. During a Q&A following the announcement that the game had been pushed back to September, CD Projekt Red joint CEO Adam Kaczynski said that crunch during this period would essentially be an inevitability. He explained,
"We try to limit crunch as much as possible, but it is the final stage. We try to be reasonable in this regard, but yes, unfortunately."
A lot of people were unhappy with Kaczynski's comments, and it's perhaps important to understand why crunch has become such an incendiary term. So, with crunch reappearing in the public eye once again, we decided now would be a good time to speak with a handful of industry insiders.
Hello.
To get their insights on crunch and why we as consumers should care about it.
I'm Mike Bithell, and I'm a director of video games. I made Thomas Was Alone, and now I work with a big team making other things like John Wick Hex and Subsurface Circular and Volume and all kinds of things. Generally, the industry defines crunch as a prolonged period of overtime, and different studios have different kind of approaches to that. Our studio, for example, has 0 overtime for employees, so we don't allow ourselves to even start down that road. It can become very easy to say, we'll just spend a few more hours a night, and then slowly that builds up into a culture that you end up kind of self-replicating.
We also spoke with Aline Mures, a producer at Austrian studio Mipumi. Mipumi has worked on major titles like Control and Hitman, as well as its own critically acclaimed narrative adventure, The Lion's Song. Aline explained to us just how wide-reaching crunch is and how it can have an impact on nearly all areas of a developer's life.
There are immediate physical and mental health effects, and it can lead to burnout or depression in the end. There are also personal impacts. Crunch puts a lot of pressure on relationships with loved ones and could lead to breakups. When working that long for such a long time, your way of thinking kind of changes. Your whole inner thinking is focused on work, and when you leave the office, it's like stepping into a different world. It takes time to let go of a project and recover, to focus on other areas of your life again. Some people do not get that time.
Aline also explained to us that working overtime during a crunch period is rarely, if ever, optional, even if it appears that it might be. It's all part of an incredibly competitive culture that permeates studios around the world.
A lot of companies ask their employees to crunch, but the employee is rarely in a position to say no without repercussions. If you have a person that went home at 5 p.m. and a person that always stayed until 12 a.m., guess who ends up being promoted? And who is considered to be a team player? There should be a paid recovery period, but this is not a given. I'm lucky to have my overtime compensated. After the project, I was sent home for some time.
The all-consuming nature of crunch was something that Mike also touched on with us, explaining that it can lead to very real long-term problems.
So the problem with the idea of optional crunch is that usually, and I've definitely experienced this personally in my career, when optional crunch is presented, your boss tells you that if you're passionate and if you care about the team, you might stick around to help them. And that's nonsense. That's an awful way to treat people. I think everyone has probably had a boss try that on them at some point in any job. They actually mean work a bit harder for me. The idea of optional crunch is nonsense. People are always pressured and explained that maybe if you want that promotion, you should probably pull the extra hours. So let's call it what it is. Let's call it, mandatory crunch. So there's fortunately been a lot of studies on crunch and how it affects people, and also obviously there's a lot of people who've experienced it. So all the studies tell us that you become much, much worse at your job. Even after about a week of crunch, it starts to kick in, it starts to diminish your ability to think and to get stuff done. It's similar to, having a few late nights. Over time, though, after weeks or months, it can actually genuinely lead to massive health complications. I've got friends who got sick doing crunch. I think all of us have those stories. People who are still dealing with kind of the fallout of those problems.
One particularly troubling anecdote regarding crunch comes from Clint Hocking, the creative director on 2005's Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. Chaos Theory is, as anyone will tell you, one of the finest stealth action games of all time. But it took a heavy toll on Hocking, who revealed in a 2015 blog post that spending most of the game's 2-year development cycle working 80-hour weeks seriously damaged his brain. He recalled meeting with a friend after finishing development on Chaos Theory. The two got to reminiscing about the last time they'd met up, only for Clint to realise that he had literally no memory of their time together.
To be clear, I don't mean I didn't remember what we did or what we talked about. I mean that I literally had no memory of the events. To me, it was like it never happened. It was like he never visited. There was just an empty space in my brain that had been overwritten by the stress and anxiety of Splinter Cell. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory gave me brain damage.
Despite the clear problems that crunch can cause, Mike argues that he doesn't expect the average consumer to come home at the end of a long day at their own difficult job and particularly care about the conditions the developer worked in. Fair enough. After all, there's a certain notion that those working in the gaming industry are living the dream. The key, Mike thinks, is simply better communication between developer and consumer.
I think we're more connected than we've ever been. We're more aware of people around the world than we've ever been. And I think that's a good thing. So yeah, we need to explain to people what crunch is. We need to explain to people that it ultimately results in slower and worse game production. I don't expect the average person out there who's working a hard job and coming home every evening to play video games as a hobby to really care that I had a tough day at work. That's fair enough. I don't expect that. But at the same time, if I'm treating my staff better, if we're all happier and we're getting on better, then that's going to lead to them getting more games. It's going to lead to them getting games that are on time and are hopefully better as well as a result. I don't think you need to necessarily be sympathetic towards game developers for crunching to understand that you're going to have a better experience as a player of games if the industry treats its staff better.
Aline also argued that awareness and proper understanding of crunch really is the crucial factor, and argued that supporting good games actually involves caring about the hard-working developers that make those games.
Making players aware of crunch hopefully contributes to humanising the perception of game developers. No developer should have to sacrifice their health and personal life when making a game. If you truly want to support good games, then care about the working conditions of the people making them.
With that said, Mike and Aline reason that there are ways to support teams going through crunch. As Aline advises, being more vocal about studios pushing for a better work-life balance for its employees, or even donating to unions that represent staff in the industry, can make a big difference.
No one's expecting you not to play a game because you hear a story about crunch on the team, but it would be awesome for all of us developers if you let publishers who make crunch games know that you're not happy with that process, and actually make it a cool thing, a positive thing, that if a game's not made with crunch, you've got a little bit more respect for it. That's all we really need, is a little bit of that consumer support and a little bit more of the audience kind of holding companies accountable for how they treat their staff. But yeah, definitely keep playing all the awesome games as well.
Of course, there's only so much we as consumers can do. While it might look like there are easy enough solutions, it's unlikely that crunch will be going anywhere anytime soon. Even over the course of writing this video, it was reported by VG247 that the team at id Software had been crunching pretty hard for most of last year to get Doom Eternal ready. That's according to the game's executive producer Marty Stratton, whose comments suggest that crunch is still absolutely the norm and is perhaps even expected to get a game finished to the quality that a studio feels the consumer deserves. The power for change then surely lies with the people in charge of these studios, the people responsible for creating, or at the very least enabling a culture where crunch can thrive and is acceptable. In this case, both Mike and Aline agree that better planning and a greater respect for the work-life balance is paramount. This would, at least on paper, lead to fewer delays, less crunch, and a more efficient, happier workforce.
We need producers and managers that respect the health and personal life of employees. Better production plans with more leeway and buffers to absorb the unexpected problems, as well as possible features to cut. Every plan should always have buffers for sickness and vacation as well.
So this is a solvable problem. We can manage our teams better, we can add contingencies and time budget that allows us to kind of avoid crunch and prepare for unforeseen circumstances. The reason people don't is because there's no consequence if they don't. The audience ultimately doesn't care. As that shifts, and we're seeing that start to shift, and part of it is the idea of players being happy if development teams get a little bit more time. If that continues, then you're definitely sending a message to the publishers and developers that they should start to behave a little bit better. We're already seeing basically people wanting to avoid the bad PR of getting a story out in the press about crunch. Big publishers, big developers have come under fire for that, and we've seen them tweak and fiddle with their approach to these problems as a result of that. So it is having an effect, and all it takes is just the audience being aware of it and caring just a little bit, maybe.
Crunch remains a very real problem then, and will likely continue to be one for some time yet. There is cause to be slightly optimistic, however. Delays on huge titles like Doom Eternal, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Cyberpunk 2077 have been met with understanding from consumers who just seem happy that the developers are taking that extra time to get it right. Why is this such a big deal? Well, compare the reaction to the recent spate of delays to even a few years ago, when the news of pretty much any game delay was met with vitriol and a genuinely nasty backlash. While delays can, and evidently do, lead to crunch periods right now, perhaps one day publishers and developers will feel they're in a position where they can delay a game for as long as it needs to be delayed by, eliminating unexpected new deadlines altogether and maybe, hopefully, doing away with crunch periods for good. It might sound like fanciful thinking right now, but as Mike told us, things are already starting to change. Clint, for example, has since returned to Ubisoft as creative director on the upcoming Watch Dogs Legion, which very much implies that, at least as far as Ubisoft is concerned, attitudes towards crunch have changed massively.
So the positive news is it is getting better. The stuff I'm talking about is on the decline. There is a pressure from outside, there's a pressure from inside to fix these systems. So if you're someone who wants to get into games, absolutely continue to follow that objective. No one wants to put you off. I want you in the industry, I want you making stuff. I'm very excited to meet you. But, hopefully we'll have solved some of these issues before you join up.